From the heart of preLights, the preprint highlighting service run by early career researchers and supported by the Company of Biologists, this is spotLights.
I'm Ryan. Today we're joined by Dr. Katelyn Cooper, an associate professor at Arizona State University. She leads the Cooper Biology Education Research Lab and directs the mental health division of the Research for Inclusive STEM Education Center. Her work focuses on inclusion, mental health, and the student experience in biology education. Together with Stefan and Reinier, we wrote a preLight covering this work. In the spotlight, I'll be chatting to her about her new preprint that we highlighted and explores the realities of LGBTQ plus researchers in the biological sciences. So to kick off, my first question is, this is one of the first large-scale analyses of LGBTQ plus climate in biology. Why do you think this gap existed for so long?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think for a really long time, there's just been a complete lack of research on the LGBTQ plus community, right? And then I think that there's perhaps an extra level of stigma in the scientific community where we often think of it as really objective and devoid of any personal influence. And of course, we know that that is not true, but that I think has kept a lot of folks from doing this research previously, but luckily we were preceded by physicists who did an LGBTQ climate and physics report. And that was, I think, almost 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And so it was definitely time to do this for biology.
Then I have a question. I'm a little bit older. I'm over 50. So I know the LGBT scene since the early 90s. And have experienced, of course, as a member of this community, things in the professional environment. And I know that 10 to 15 years ago, there was not too much acceptance, even not for cis LGBT people. And so something obviously has changed. One result of your paper is that at least cis LGBT people feel more accepted and included than gender not conforming people, which is a proceeding and a good one. Would you say that it needed those 10 years you were also talking about? I mean, my question is, why are they better accepted today than 10 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think across the world, we've definitely made a lot of steps in a more accepting direction, right? Here in the US, we had things like gay marriage was legalized, right? And that was a huge step for the United States in terms of adopting a more accepting view of LGBTQ plus individuals. And I do think, over time, we've seen poll after poll just see that acceptance rate increase. And I think that not only makes societies, like the societies who participated in this study, more willing to engage their members in the opportunity to participate, but also makes LGBTQ folks feel more comfortable, as you said, right? Like this is, it's kind of a feedback loop in that people are feeling more comfortable, right? So they're likely to engage in a survey, right? Report their identities, things that they may have been very uncomfortable to do 10 years ago. And as a result, we're seeing more comfortable, particularly, as you said, cis LGBTQ biologists reporting that they feel like they belong in the workplace just as much as their straight cis peers, right? And that's really encouraging. But that said, of course, we're missing folks that are probably the most uncomfortable, right? And that will always be the problem with this type of survey is that we're never going to have a beautiful randomized control trial of getting people to fill out this type of survey. So it's always good to read these results with a grain of salt, remembering that we're probably not capturing folks who are the least comfortable.
I kind of have a two-in-one question, I guess, next. What was something that you found hopeful or encouraging that came out of the data? But on the other hand, was there any findings that felt urgent or worrying?
Yes, absolutely. So something that I found particularly encouraging and surprising, and something that I did not think that I would necessarily see in my lifetime, is that cis LGBTQ biologists reported the same, essentially, feelings of morale and belonging within the biology community as their straight cis peers. And to me, as we were just saying, that's incredibly encouraging because we know that there was a gap there, right? And to see that gap start to close and really move in the right direction is just incredible, right? And it means a lot of people are feeling safe at work. But to the second part of your question, where do we have room to grow and what's concerning? And I think that is certainly that across the board, we know that TGNC, or transgender and gender nonconforming individuals, are consistently reporting lower morale and lower belonging in their societies, in the biology community, and in the workplace. And I think even more concerningly is that people are still being actively discriminated against, right? And that was something that I don't think, unfortunately, was necessarily surprising to us. But any person that's being actively discriminated against because of their LGBTQ identity is one person too many. And so the fact that we had a substantial percent of folks, I think about 38% of transgender and gender nonconforming individuals and 13% of cis LGBTQ plus biologists reporting that they have personally experienced exclusionary, intimidating, offensive, or hostile behavior at work was just really disheartening, and something that we can all focus our attention on, hopefully preventing as we move forward.
Do you think that this concerns the biologically environment in a specific way different to other scientific directions? And why is it like that, in case you say, yes, it's a specific case?
Sure. So I think the biology environment, particularly in academic biology and professional biology, I think it can be really different, of course, from the arts and humanities, which we know to just have more accepting environments. But when we think about it in comparison to other sciences, we know that as biologists, we're often encountering these pervasive myths regarding the biology of attraction, right? The biology of gender, genetics, reproduction, hormones, and sexuality. And those are things that we've probably been exposed to since grade school and continue to get exposed to some of those thoughts. And some of us as biologists may be even expected to teach content that has been historically influenced by cis heteronormative thought. And so I think that the content of biology has this really unique intersection with this identity. I cannot speak to whether our belonging as LGBTQ plus biologists in our biology community is different than physicists or chemists. But I do think that what is unique about biology is the intersection of the content. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't have the data behind that, but I think that we are faced with more things kind of on a daily basis that might make us think more about our LGBTQ identity than people in other sciences.
I agree, yeah.
So you say you couldn't look between different sciences, right? But did you look between sort of early career versus more senior LGBTQ plus sciences? And did you find any differences between their responses?
You know what? I would have to go back and look specifically at the paper. What we do know about age is that, obviously folks who are younger tend to be more out and tend to be more comfortable with their LGBTQ plus identities. But I would have to look further into that question.
No worries. Thank you so much.
I have a question. I remember the 1990s, and I'm not talking about professional context, but about inside the LGBT community, there was a large and very noticeable gap between lesbians and gays, for example. Now the times changed and we consider ourselves as member of a queer community or an LGBT community. But does this aspect also regarding gender non-conforming people still exist, that trans women, either inside the LGBT community itself or in the professional context, more discriminated than trans men, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that that's something that Ryan had brought up earlier, that I think there's literature to suggest, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's literature to suggest that I think trans women experience more discrimination than trans men. We did not run that particular analysis in the preprint that we provided, but we should have the data to do so. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that that's an important point that, something I think we were excited about regarding this work is the ability to just begin to disaggregate identities, because due to the really low sample sizes historically for many reasons, right? It's been often hard to differentiate identities across the LGBTQ plus spectrum, which has brought some problems because obviously everyone's experience is different. But I think you bring up a good point that even within one letter, right? So I think, right, transgender individuals or gender non-binary individuals, the experiences are vastly different. And so we are still making kind of broad proclamations and want to be thoughtful that that might not be the case for everybody, right, who identifies in a particular way.
So, like you said, everyone's experiences are going to be different, like regardless of the letter. But I guess it also holds true that people's experiences are going to be different depending on like what university they're in, what country they're in, and not even like if their lab group is particularly like supportive. Like I've been very lucky that my PI is probably like the most supportive PI I know. He's really great. But to go back to what we were talking about before, you said that nearly 2 in 5 TGNC biologists had faced exclusionary behaviour. Is there anything on sort of like an institution level that you would recommend they can respond to that?
Yeah, I think that we wanted to be really thoughtful about not tying folks to their institution just to make sure that we were keeping things as anonymous as possible. But there has been some research out of my lab recently, thinking specifically contextually within the US. We've looked at if undergraduate students actually hold biases against instructors who reveal their LGBTQ plus identity. So we actually were able to do a really nice randomized control trial. And again, a result I did not think I would see in my lifetime is that we don't see biases at the undergraduate level, right? On average, students aren't judging LGBTQ faculty who come out more harshly. They're not perceiving them as less competent. They're right. If anything, they actually perceive them as slightly more approachable. And now we looked at where someone lived in the US predicted, right, their response. And we thought that for sure it would, because there are places that in the United States are more conservative and tend to be viewed as less LGBTQ friendly. And in fact, there are states get LGBTQ friendliness scores. And so we use those in our models. And it did not actually impact students' ratings. And that was really encouraging to us, because what was interesting is it did predict how students thought their peers would react. So the more conservative a place they were in, they thought, oh, it's more likely that my peers will discriminate against this person. But that's not what we actually saw. So we're seeing this actually in a number of studies. So we're starting to become encouraged that perhaps this younger generation, there's just more acceptance across the board, and it's perhaps not so dependent on where you've been raised and where you're coming from. But that being said, I think, we have plenty of other evidence that there are institutions and, right, I've talked with folks at religious institutions who cannot come out because they feel as though they would be fired. And like you said, there are people who would never come out to their advisor because their advisor has said something in passing. And so we know that LGBTQ folks are really, really good at picking up cues and very good at looking for those cues. And whether those cues are a small rainbow sticker outside of someone's office, they're good at picking up on that, knowing that that person's probably safe and accepting to talk with. And then they pick up on things said in passing, right? They pick up on perceived kind of political leanings and things like that. And that can really cause them to feel much more guarded. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question. I would say the short answer to your question is we did not look specifically at universities for the sake of ensuring that our participants were anonymous. That being said, it's very common that people coming from particularly the South in the United States experience and report more discrimination than folks in other parts of the country. But hopefully with this new generation, we're not seeing those divisions as strongly anymore.
I had a quick follow-up with that. That was actually really, really interesting. Did you see any sort of like results that show LGBT undergraduates who were taught by the professors that had come out felt any more sort of belonging within the institution?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can also kind of link to some of these other studies, but we have looked at the impact of LGBTQ instructors coming out to students, and I want to specify that they come out within 3 seconds on the first day of class, right? This is not some long soliloquy about their life story. This can be done in 3 seconds. This is my favorite food. I like hiking. I'm a proud member of the LGBTQ community. You go on to do the rest of your thing. And what we found is that is really impactful, not only for LGBTQ students, but it's also disproportionately impactful for women. So the vast majority of students either say it didn't affect me or it affected me positively. And then we see the positive impacts in terms of, feeling safe and like you belong, feeling like the instructor is approachable, disproportionately so for women and LGBTQ students. So that's something that's exciting for us because it's suggesting it's not harming anyone, not a surprise, but it's either not affecting students or it's having a positive impact.
I have a question because I heard you repeatedly using the word feeling safe. Did your convey give indications that this play a role even in the academic world?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually did an interview study 10 years ago, and we just finished up an interview study following up on that, right? Because again, a ton has changed in the last 10 years. And what we found is that a lot of the discrimination our students experience is very subtle, right? We're talking about microaggressions, questioning someone's sexuality, right? Making a particular comment, maybe in passing about transgender celebrity, right? That then maybe it's not directed at them, right? But they're internalizing that comment. And so we're not really hearing about overt acts of discrimination, but more of these subtle things. And where students talk a lot about safety is almost like, I never know what's going to happen. And I think that this is particularly true for our transgender and gender nonconforming peers, is that you never know what's going to happen, and you're preparing for the worst, right? Because you just don't know. And so there's a sense of safety that if something were to happen in class, that instructor would be an ally, would be protective of you and on your side. And that, I think, was where that term safety came from, is they were like, well, just in case, I know my instructor would step in if there were ever a situation.
My question then would be, what can allies do to keep promoting LGBTQ plus inclusion?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, LGBTQ folks are really good at picking up cues. So any little symbol that you can have that you are a supportive person for the LGBTQ plus community, I think is usually appreciated. So if you are a faculty member, this might look like a small statement on your syllabus, right? Or a small statement on your research website. If you're more in research or industry, a sticker outside your door, right? These small things can be really helpful in just showing support. Now, I think that, true allies can listen and observe and identify potential issues within their departments, within their places of work, and really do the advocacy effort. And that is where it really takes some of the burden off of LGBTQ folks, because usually that is left to them. And again, making sure it's something that they want, right, is really important. Making sure that step is actually going to be helpful and not harmful. But those are small things. Well, that's not small, right? That's big. But you can kind of do anything along the lines of like a small symbol of standing with the community, to really advocating for more inclusive practices in your workplace, to just really ensuring and calling out instances of discrimination, right? And sometimes it's not calling out, sometimes it's calling in, right? Sometimes it's sitting with someone in private and saying, hey, I know, you misgendered someone. This is a better way to handle it next time, or maybe you need to start practicing that on your own time so that doesn't happen again, right? And just small things like that you can do to take the burden off of some of the folks in the community who are trying to do that work.
I had a question concerning the methodology that you used. From experience, I know that it is quite difficult to ask somebody from the LGBT community and LGBT members that would not consider themselves as members of that community, to talk with them, to ask them, how could you figure out that people answer about their own identity and identity belonging kind of correctly?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We allowed folks to self-identify, right, their gender identity and their sexual orientation identity separately on the survey. And some of the steps we took to ensure that people were comfortable. So first of all, the study was not incentivized. And so that's really important because there is no reason to help us out because you're not going to get anything in return, right? So there's no reason to kind of do the survey for doing the survey's sake. I think most folks who were participating were very supportive of their, I shouldn't say supportive, I would say most folks who participated felt like they wanted to give back to their scientific society in some way, give them some idea of the climate that was there. And so when we allow people to self-identify, and they could self-identify as more than one identity, right? So you might say, I identify as bisexual and I also identify as queer. So your question basically is like, how do we know that people are telling the truth on those particular questions?
Yes. What I understood is that you directly asked them about their identity feeling and their sexual preferences. It was not asked again later on in the convey.
No, we only asked it once. We feel that people are pretty, again, if they're volunteering to take this survey, that we feel that they'll be pretty open and honest with us. And I think that how you perceive yourself is what matters most, right? In terms of particularly with these identities. And we were really thoughtful on trying to ensure anonymity, right? So we did not ask for folks' names. We did not ask for their institutions. We tried to be as anonymous as possible, again, if it was someone who maybe would withhold a particular identity because they didn't feel safe, we tried to, address that by making it more anonymous. But we did not ask them to report their identities more than once.
Then maybe you already said this, but I didn't get it. Maybe how did you find the people that participated?
Yeah, so we actually were really, really grateful to the American Society of Cell Biology. The CEO, Rebecca Avanya, actually reached out to other scientific societies and asked them if they would be interested in partnering with us for this survey. And we had a total of 5 societies say yes. And so that was really wonderful because, again, it shows how far our communities have come that we said, we really want to do a climate survey of your society broadly, and we want to survey both LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ folks. And then we will provide you with that data. And so we had the Genetic Society of America, the Biophysical Society, the International Society for Stem Cell Research, and the Society for the Advancement of Biology Education Research all send our survey out to their entire membership and ask them to participate. And then we did additional recruiting of LGBTQ plus participants because we knew we wanted to have as big of sample as possible of the LGBTQ plus folks. So we reached out through if there were any sub-communities within those memberships. We posted on Twitter, or X or whatever it's called. We posted on different social media platforms and tried to recruit LGBTQ plus people, scientists specifically. It was all biologists.
If you could look, say, 5 or 10 years ahead, what would a win look like? So what change would make you feel like people really responded to this study?
Oh, man, a win would be a really boring paper to read, right? It would be data that is showing that there are no differences in terms of the sense of belonging and sense of morale between LGBTQ plus individuals and straight cis individuals in biology. It would say that not one person has experienced discrimination in the workplace. And I think, most importantly, folks would just feel like they have this protective community around them, right? That being a biologist is really phenomenal and that their identity, they get to bring it to work and own their identity and they don't have to push it aside. And yeah, that we just are able to close all of those gaps. So that would be incredible. And, again, if you would have asked me this 10 years ago, we've seen some of these gaps close, right? And importantly, this was done prior to January 2025, right? So in the US, there has obviously been a lot of national change in terms of how LGBTQ plus folks feel. That's what I would guess. And so I'm sure that in some ways, some of these gaps have perhaps opened back up. But that's all to say, I think that change is possible, even though it sounds kind of, overwhelming to think about all of these gaps closing, particularly for transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. But the fact that we really got to see that happen for some of our LGBTQ cis biologists is encouraging. And I hope that, when we talk about this, hopefully again in 10 years, it's really boring. And I only answer one or two questions about how great the state of biology is.
Hopefully.
So you said in the study that the top 3 things that LGBTQ plus folks asked for were more visible support, affinity groups, and representation. Which of these do you think could make the biggest difference the fastest?
I'm going to say more visible support. And I think that is because that's really asking the allies in the community to step up and provide that support. And I think that, when you're able to reach outside of the community and get support from others, that's incredibly helpful. And then with that, it's kind of a trickle-down effect. I would imagine more people are going to feel more comfortable coming out and providing those examples of prominent LGBTQ people in the field. And so, I would go with more prominent support from people who are not necessarily in the LGBTQ plus community.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate, for coming to talk to us about your preprint. We look forward to seeing your published work. And if you go and see more of our opinions and read our preLights.